She was born in a town that most people drove through without stopping. The kind of place where the biggest building was a grain silo, and the only restaurant closed at 7 because nobody stayed out late anyway. It sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by flat fields that stretched so far you could see the curve of the earth if you squinted hard enough. Her family lived in a small house on the edge of town. The paint was peeling on the outside, and the porch steps creaked so loud you could hear someone coming from a block away. But her mother kept the inside clean and warm, filled with the smell of whatever she managed to cook that night. They didn't have much, but they had each other. That's what her mother always said when things got hard. Her father worked at the factory on the other side of the highway. He left before sunrise and came home after dark, his hands rough and his back always hurting. Some nights he was so tired he fell asleep at the dinner table, his head dropping forward while her mother gently took the fork from his hand. He never complained, though. He just kept going, day after day, because that's what fathers did. Her mother cleaned houses for the wealthier families in the next town over. She would take the bus early in the morning and come back in the evening with aching knees and chapped hands. Sometimes she brought home things those families threw away. A lamp that still worked, books with bent covers. Once, she brought home a small keyboard that one of the families was getting rid of because their son had lost interest in it. That keyboard changed everything. She was only 7 years old when her mother set it down on the kitchen table. Half the keys were sticky, and the sound that came out was thin and cheap. But when she pressed her fingers to those keys for the first time, something happened inside her chest. It was like a door opened that she never knew existed. The notes weren't just sounds. They were feelings. They were colors. They were everything she couldn't say out loud. She taught herself to play. There was no money for lessons. No teacher in town who knew anything about music anyway. So she figured it out on her own. She would sit for hours, pressing keys, listening, trying again. Her fingers learned to find the right notes the way water learns to find its way downhill. It just happened, naturally. Like it was always supposed to be this way. Her parents didn't understand it. They loved her. But music wasn't something people like them thought about. Music was for rich kids in big cities. Music was a hobby, not a future. Her father would come home and see her sitting at that little keyboard, and he would shake his head with a tired smile. "That's nice, sweetheart," he would say. "But don't forget to do your homework." She always did her homework. She was a good student, quiet and obedient. But school felt like something she had to get through, so she could get back to the music. She sat in the back of the classroom, invisible to most of her teachers. She wasn't the kind of student who raised her hand or spoke up. She wasn't the kind of student anyone remembered. The other kids didn't notice her either. She was too quiet, too different. While they talked about TV shows and sports, and who liked who, she was somewhere else entirely. Her mind was always playing melodies, working out harmonies, hearing songs that didn't exist yet. She learned to keep this hidden. Kids didn't like different. Different got you laughed at. Different got you left out. So she became a ghost. She moved through school like a shadow, never making trouble, never standing out. Teachers wrote the same thing on every report card. Quiet and well-behaved. Could participate more in class. They didn't see what was happening inside her head. They didn't know that behind those silent eyes was a universe of sound, growing bigger every day. When she was 12, the keyboard finally died. The batteries corroded, and something inside it broke that couldn't be fixed. She cried that night, quiet tears into her pillow so her parents wouldn't hear. It felt like losing a friend. The only friend who truly understood her. But then she discovered the church. It was a small wooden building at the end of her street. Paint fading. Steeple leaning slightly to one side. The congregation had shrunk over the years, until only a handful of elderly folks showed up on Sundays. But inside that church sat an old, upright piano. It was out of tune, and some of the keys stuck, but it was real, it was beautiful, and most importantly, the church was never locked. She started sneaking out at night. She would wait until her parents were asleep, then slip out through her bedroom window. The walk to the church only took a few minutes, but it felt like crossing into another world. The night air was cool and the stars were bright in a way they never were in big cities. She could hear crickets singing and the distant sound of trucks on the highway. Inside the church, everything was still. Moonlight came through the windows and fell across the wooden pews like silver ribbons. She would make her way to the piano, her heart beating fast, and sit down on the old bench. The first note always echoed in the empty space, filling the church with sound. And then she would play. She played for hours. She played until her fingers hurt and her eyes grew heavy. She played pieces she remembered from videos she'd watched at the library. She played songs she heard on the radio, and slowly, she started playing things that came from somewhere inside her. Melodies that had no name. Compositions that existed nowhere else in the world. Nobody knew about these midnight sessions. Her parents slept soundly, exhausted from their long days. The town was quiet and dark, everyone tucked away in their beds. She was completely alone with the music. And somehow, that was exactly what she needed. The years passed this way. By day, she was invisible. The quiet girl in the back row. The one nobody expected anything from. Her guidance counselor told her to think about practical careers. Maybe she could work at the factory like her father. Maybe she could learn to be a secretary. "You need to be realistic," the counselor said, not unkindly. "Not everyone gets to follow their dreams." She nodded and said nothing. What could she say? That every night she played music that made her feel more alive than anything else in the world? That she heard symphonies in her head that she didn't have words to describe? They would think she was crazy, or worse, they would laugh, so she kept her secret. She went to school, did her homework, helped her mother with chores, and waited for night to come. The piano in the church became her entire world, the only place where she felt like herself, the only place where she wasn't invisible. She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. A single piece of paper would soon arrive that would force her to make a choice. Keep hiding in the shadows, safe and small. Or step into the light and show the world what she could do. But that night, as she sat in the moonlit church with her fingers resting on the keys, she had no idea what was coming. She just played. Note after note. Song after song, pouring her entire heart into music that nobody else would ever hear, or so she thought. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of ordinary day that gives no warning it's about to change your life. She was 16 years old, walking through the main hallway of her high school with her head down like always. Students pushed past her without a glance. Lockers slammed. Laughter echoed off the walls. She was just trying to get to her next class without being noticed. That's when she saw it. A bright yellow flyer pinned to the bulletin board outside the main office. Most of the board was covered with old announcements nobody read anymore. Club meetings, lost items, fundraiser reminders. But this flyer was different. It seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, demanding attention. She stopped walking. Something pulled her toward it, like a hand on her shoulder guiding her closer. She read the words slowly, her heart beating faster with each line. It was an announcement for open auditions at one of the most prestigious music academies in the country. A place she had only heard about in whispers and dreams. The kind of school where legends were made, where ordinary kids walked in and concert pianists walked out. They were offering a full scholarship to one exceptional student. All expenses paid. Tuition, housing, everything. The only requirement was talent. She read the flyer 3 times, making sure she understood correctly. Open auditions. That meant anyone could try. You didn't need to come from a famous music school. You didn't need recommendations from important teachers. You just needed to show up and play. Her hands started shaking. This was it. This was the door she had been waiting for her entire life. A way out of this small town. A chance to become something more than invisible. She tore a small tab from the bottom of the flyer. It had a website address and an audition date printed on it. She stuffed it into her pocket like it was made of gold and hurried to class, her mind spinning so fast she couldn't think straight. For the rest of the day, she couldn't concentrate on anything. Teachers talked and she heard nothing. Friends chatted around her and she sat in silence. All she could think about was that flyer, that audition, that impossible, beautiful chance. After school, she went to the library. The computers there were old and slow, but they worked. She typed in the website address with trembling fingers and waited for the page to load. When it finally appeared, her breath caught in her throat. The academy was even more impressive than she imagined. Photos showed grand concert halls with velvet seats, practice rooms filled with shining pianos, students performing on stages around the world. The list of famous graduates included names she recognized from the classical albums she borrowed from the library. Composers, conductors, musicians who had changed the world with their art, and they were offering one spot, one scholarship. To someone like her, she scrolled down to the requirements. Applicants needed to prepare 2 pieces for the audition, 1 classical composition from a provided list, 1 original piece, or personal selection, that showcased their unique style. The panel would judge based on technical skill, emotional depth, and artistic potential. She could do this. She knew she could. All those nights in the church, all those hours teaching herself, all those melodies that lived inside her head. This was her moment. But then reality came crashing back. The audition was in the city, 300 miles away. She would need money for a bus ticket, money for a place to stay, money she didn't have. Her family barely made it through each month. Asking them for something like this felt impossible. And then there was the bigger problem, the one she didn't want to face. Nobody believed in her. She thought about telling her mother that night, but the words got stuck in her throat. Her mother came home exhausted as usual, her feet swollen from standing all day. She made dinner while humming softly, the way she always did. When she asked how school was, her daughter just shrugged and said it was fine. The next day, she decided to talk to her guidance counselor. Maybe there was some kind of help available. Maybe the school could support her somehow. She waited until lunch period and knocked on the counselor's door with her heart pounding in her ears. The counselor was a middle-aged woman with a tired smile and a desk covered in paperwork. She waved her in and told her to sit down. She pulled out the flyer and placed it on the desk. She explained about the audition, the scholarship, the chance of a lifetime. She spoke quickly, her voice shaking with excitement and fear. When she finished, she looked up, hoping to see encouragement. Instead, the counselor sighed. It wasn't a mean sigh. It was the kind of sigh people give when they think they're being kind by telling you the truth. The counselor picked up the flyer and glanced at it, then set it back down. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "do you know how competitive these things are?" She nodded but didn't speak. Kids who audition for schools like this have been training since they were toddlers. They have private coaches. They've performed in recitals and competitions for years. Their parents spend thousands of dollars on lessons. The counselor leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I just don't want you to set yourself up for disappointment. You're a smart girl. You could do well in a practical field. Maybe office work. Maybe healthcare, something stable." She felt her chest tighten. The words hit her like stones. "I'm just being realistic," the counselor continued. "Some doors aren't meant for everyone. That doesn't make you less valuable. It just means you need to find a different path." She left the office without saying another word. The flyer was still in her hand, now crumpled at the edges. She walked to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and let the tears come. Maybe the counselor was right. Maybe she was foolish to think she could compete with kids who had every advantage she lacked. She had never taken a real lesson. She had never performed for anyone. Her only teacher was an out-of-tune piano in an empty church. That night, she decided to tell her mother everything. They sat together at the kitchen table after her father had gone to bed. Her mother listened quietly, her tired eyes focused on her daughter's face. When she finished talking, There was a long silence. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "Baby," her mother said softly, "I believe you're talented. I've heard you humming melodies since you were tiny. I know there's music in you." Hope flickered in her chest. "But this academy, it's in a different world. A world we don't belong to. And if you go there and fail, it will break your heart. I can't watch that happen to you." Her mother's eyes were wet now. "We can't afford disappointment," she whispered. "We barely afford what we have." She understood what her mother was saying. She really did. Her mother wasn't being cruel. She was being protective. In their world, dreams were dangerous. Dreams cost money and time and energy that poor people couldn't spare. Dreams could crush you if they didn't come true. She went to bed that night feeling emptier than she had in years. The flyer sat on her nightstand, mocking her. Everyone was telling her the same thing. Give up. Be realistic. Know your place. But somewhere deep inside her, a small voice refused to be silenced. She thought about all those nights in the church, all those hours playing in the dark, all those melodies that poured out of her like water from a spring. That wasn't nothing. That was real. That was hers, and if she didn't try, she would never know. She got out of bed. Her family was asleep. The house was silent. She crept to the living room, where an old computer sat in the corner. The one her father used to look for extra work sometimes. She turned it on and waited for it to boot up. Her hands were steady now. Her mind was clear. She found the audition website. She filled out the application form. Her name, her age, her contact information. When it asked about her musical background, she paused. Then she typed the truth. Self-taught. Her finger hovered over the submit button. This was crazy. Everyone said so. But crazy was better than spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been. She clicked submit, and just like that, there was no turning back. The day of the audition arrived faster than she expected. 4 weeks of waiting. 4 weeks of practicing every night in that old church. And suddenly it was here. She woke up before dawn with her stomach twisted into knots. She had told her parents she was going on a school trip. A college visit, she said. They believed her because she had never lied to them before. Her mother packed her a sandwich and gave her a long hug at the door. Her father pressed $20 into her hand, money he probably couldn't spare, and told her to be safe. The guilt sat heavy in her chest as she walked to the bus station. She hated lying to them, but she knew if she told them the truth, they would try to stop her. They would worry. They would remind her of all the reasons this was a mistake. She couldn't hear that today. Not today. The bus ride took 6 hours. She sat by the window and watched the flat farmland slowly give way to suburbs. Then to the edges of a city bigger than anything she had ever seen. Buildings rose up like mountains made of glass and steel. Cars filled the streets in endless rivers of metal. People walked everywhere, thousands of them, all moving with purpose and confidence. She had never felt so small in her life. The academy was located in the heart of downtown. She had memorized the directions from the bus station, but nothing prepared her for what she saw when she turned the corner and found herself standing in front of it. The building looked like a palace. Tall, white columns framed the entrance. Giant windows sparkled in the afternoon sun. Stone steps led up to massive wooden doors that seemed designed to make everyone who approached feel insignificant. Above the entrance, carved in gold letters, was the name of the academy, a name that had produced some of the greatest musicians in history. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. People streamed past her, walking up those steps like they belonged there. They wore expensive clothes. They carried instrument cases that probably cost more than her family's car. They laughed and chatted with ease, greeting each other like old friends at a reunion. She looked down at herself. She was wearing the nicest dress she owned, a simple blue thing her mother had bought at a thrift store 2 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but standing here among these people, she felt like a weed in a garden of roses. For a moment, she considered turning around, getting back on the bus, going home and pretending this had never happened. Nobody would ever know. She could return to her invisible life and forget she had ever dared to dream this big. But then she thought about all those nights in the church. All that music living inside her with nowhere to go. If she left now, she would carry that weight forever. The wondering. The what-ifs. The slow death of a dream she never even tried to chase. She took a deep breath and walked up the steps. Inside, the building was even more intimidating. The lobby had marble floors so polished, she could see her reflection. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and everywhere she looked, there were signs of wealth and prestige she had only seen in movies. A woman at a registration desk directed her to the audition waiting area. She followed the signs down a long hallway lined with portraits of famous graduates. Composers who had written symphonies performed around the world, pianists who had played for presidents and kings. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she walked, asking the same question everyone else was asking. What are you doing here? The waiting area was a large room filled with chairs and nervous energy. Dozens of young musicians sat with their parents and coaches, preparing for their moment. She found an empty seat in the corner and tried to make herself invisible, the way she had learned to do at school. It didn't take long to realize she was completely out of her league. The boy sitting across from her was reviewing sheet music with a woman who was clearly a professional instructor. They spoke in technical terms she barely understood, discussing dynamics and phrasing and interpretation. His fingers moved in the air, practicing passages without a piano. His eyes closed in concentration. A girl nearby was doing breathing exercises while her mother rubbed her shoulders and whispered encouragement. Her dress probably cost more than everything in the room where she slept back home. On her lap was a folder thick with certificates and awards. She heard fragments of conversations all around her. Kids talking about the conservatories where they had trained, the competitions they had won, the famous teachers who had mentored them. One boy casually mentioned that he had performed at a concert hall in Europe last summer. The others nodded like this was completely normal. Nobody looked at her. Nobody spoke to her. She was invisible here just like she was invisible everywhere else. But this time, being invisible felt like a curse rather than a shield. These people didn't ignore her because she was quiet. They ignored her because she didn't matter. She wasn't competition. She wasn't even worth noticing. A girl with perfect posture and shiny black hair glanced in her direction. Their eyes met for a brief second. The girl looked her up and down, taking in the thrift store dress and the lack of an instrument case and the absence of any adult companion. Then she leaned over to her friend and whispered something. They both giggled softly. The shame burned hot in her cheeks. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to melt into the floor and never be seen again. Hours passed. Names were called one by one. Musicians walked through a set of heavy doors and into the audition room beyond. Some came out smiling. Others came out crying. Most came out with blank expressions that revealed nothing. The waiting room slowly emptied. Parents paced. Coaches gave last-minute advice. Everyone seemed to have someone. Everyone except her. She sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, trying to control her breathing. She had no sheet music to review. No coach to guide her. No parent to comfort her. All she had was the music in her head and the desperate hope that it would be enough. Finally, a woman with a clipboard appeared at the door. "Last audition of the day," she announced, reading from her list. Then she called out a name. Her name. She stood up on legs that felt like they might collapse beneath her. The room seemed to spin. The walk to the door felt like a walk to her own execution. As she passed the girl who had laughed at her, she heard a whisper just loud enough to catch. "This should be quick." More giggles. She pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into the audition room. It was a concert hall in miniature. A small stage with a single spotlight. Rows of empty seats stretching back into shadow. And there, in the front row, sat the judges. There were 5 of them, 3 women and 2 men. They sat behind a long table covered with papers and evaluation forms. Their faces were serious, professional, impossible to read. One of them was typing something on a laptop without looking up. Another was rubbing his eyes like he had been doing this all day and couldn't wait for it to be over. On the stage, under that single spotlight, sat the most beautiful piano she had ever seen. A grand piano, black and gleaming, its lid raised like a wing ready to take flight. It was nothing like the old upright in the church. This was an instrument built for concert halls and standing ovations. An instrument made for masters. She walked toward it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. One of the judges, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, looked up from her papers. "Name and background," she said. Her voice was flat, bored. The voice of someone who had heard 100 young musicians today and expected nothing new. She stated her name. Then she said the words that made the judges exchange glances. "Self-taught." The silver-haired woman raised an eyebrow. Another judge sighed audibly and leaned back in his chair. She saw him check his watch. "Whenever you're ready," the woman said, gesturing toward the piano. She walked to the bench and sat down. The leather was cool beneath her. The keys stretched out before her. Perfect and white. Waiting. She placed her fingers on the piano. The room was silent. The judges were waiting. Everyone who had ever doubted her was waiting. And in that moment, she made a decision. She wasn't going to play the classical piece she had prepared. She wasn't going to try to be something she wasn't. She had spent her whole life being invisible, being underestimated, being told to know her place. Not anymore. She closed her eyes and began to play. The first note rang out into the silence like a heartbeat. It was soft, almost fragile. The kind of sound that made you lean forward without realizing it. Straining to hear what came next, she kept her eyes closed. She couldn't look at the judges. She couldn't look at the empty seats, or the spotlight, or any of it. If she opened her eyes, she would remember where she was. She would remember all the reasons she didn't belong here, and then the fear would win. So she kept them closed and let her fingers do what they had learned to do in all those years of darkness. The melody began to unfold. It wasn't the classical piece she had practiced. It wasn't anything anyone in this room had ever heard before. It was hers, a composition she had created during those long nights in the church, sitting alone at that old piano while the rest of the world slept. She called it nothing. It had no name. But if it did, she would have called it everything she couldn't say. The music started slow, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, gentle notes that spoke of quiet mornings and empty rooms, of being small and unseen, of watching the world through a window and wondering if you would ever be part of it. In the front row, one of the judges stopped typing on his laptop. He looked up, his fingers frozen above the keys. She didn't notice. She was somewhere else now, somewhere the judges couldn't reach, somewhere safe. The melody grew. It deepened. The gentle notes became something stronger, more urgent. This was the part of the song that always made her chest ache when she played it. The part that sounded like longing, like reaching for something you could almost touch but never quite hold. It was the sound of her father's tired eyes when he came home from work. The sound of her mother's hands, rough and cracked from cleaning other people's houses. The sound of a little girl pressing her ear to a broken keyboard, desperate to find the music hidden inside. Another judge shifted in her seat. She was an older woman with gray streaks in her hair and glasses perched on her nose. She had been looking at evaluation forms when the music started. Now the forms sat forgotten in her lap. Her pen had slipped from her fingers and rolled onto the floor, but she didn't move to pick it up. The music kept building. There was pain in it now. Real pain. The kind that comes from being told you aren't good enough. From being invisible in a room full of people. From carrying a dream so big it feels like it might crush you. She played the memory of the guidance counselor's sigh. She played the looks from kids at school who never bothered to learn her name. She played every time someone had told her to be realistic, to know her place, to stop reaching for things that weren't meant for people like her. The notes crashed and swelled like waves against rocks. Her fingers moved faster, finding chords she didn't even know she knew. The piano responded like it had been waiting for her all along, like it recognized her, like it understood. The silver-haired judge in the center of the panel had stopped writing entirely. Her sharp eyes were fixed on the stage, watching the girl at the piano with an expression that was impossible to read. Her lips were slightly parted, her hand was pressed flat against her chest. And then the music changed again. The storm passed. The crashing waves became something softer, something like hope. This was the part she had written just last week, sitting in the church after everyone else had gone to sleep. The part that came after she had submitted the application. The part that sounded like taking a chance, like standing up even when your legs are shaking, like saying yes to something terrifying because the alternative is spending your whole life wondering what if. The melody lifted. It soared. It became something beautiful and aching and true. She thought about the bus ride that morning, the city rising up around her like a forest of glass. The fear she felt walking up those marble steps. The way those girls had laughed at her, the judge who checked his watch like she wasn't worth his time. None of it mattered now. None of it could touch her here, because this was who she really was. Not the quiet girl in the back row. Not the invisible shadow that nobody noticed. She was this. This music. This moment. This truth that had been living inside her since she was 7 years old, pressing her fingers to a broken keyboard in a tiny kitchen. The room had gone completely still. Not a single person moved. Not a single person breathed. The silver-haired judge was crying. She didn't make a sound. She didn't wipe her eyes. The tears just fell, sliding down her cheeks and dropping onto the papers in front of her. She had been a judge at this academy for over 20 years. She had heard thousands of auditions. She had discovered talents that went on to perform at the greatest concert halls in the world. She had never heard anything like this. The music reached its final movement. The melody that had started so softly now filled every corner of the room. It was the sound of someone finding their voice after years of silence. The sound of someone stepping out of the shadows and into the light. She played the last phrase slowly, letting each note hang in the air like a question. And then, with a gentleness that felt almost like a whisper, she played the final chord. The sound faded. The room was silent. She opened her eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. The judges sat frozen. The air felt thick, charged with something electric. She couldn't read their faces. She didn't know if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or done something incredible. Then the silver-haired judge stood up. She pushed back her chair and rose to her feet, her eyes still wet, her hands coming together in front of her chest. She started to clap. One by one, the other judges followed. They stood from their seats and joined in, their applause echoing through the small concert hall like thunder. She sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, unable to move, unable to believe what was happening. These people had spent the entire day listening to prodigies. Kids who had trained at the best schools. Kids with coaches and awards and every advantage money could buy. And now they were standing. For her, the silver-haired judge walked toward the stage. Her steps were slow, measured, like she was approaching something sacred. She stopped at the edge of the stage and looked up at the girl sitting at the piano. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How old are you?" 16, she answered. Her voice came out shaky, barely audible. "And you taught yourself? No formal training? No private instruction?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The judge was quiet for a long moment. She studied the girl's face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then she shook her head slowly, a smile spreading across her lips. "That piece you just played," she said. "What is it called?" She swallowed hard. "It doesn't have a name. You wrote it yourself?" "Yes." The judge let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. But it wasn't mocking. It was the sound of disbelief, of wonder. "I have been doing this for 23 years, she said. "I have discovered some of the finest talents in the world. I have heard performances that brought audiences to their feet in Carnegie Hall." She paused, her eyes locking onto the girls. "I have never heard anything like what you just played." The other judges had gathered behind her now. They were all looking at her with the same expression. Like they had just witnessed something impossible. Like they had just watched someone walk on water. The silver-haired judge reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. She held it up to the girl. "This is my personal number," she said. "You will be hearing from us very soon." She took the card with trembling fingers. "But I want you to know something right now," the judge continued. "Before you leave this room, before you go back to wherever you came from." Uh. She leaned closer, her voice soft but certain. "You belong here. Do you understand me? You have always belonged here. The world just hadn't found you yet." The tears came then. She couldn't stop them. They spilled down her cheeks as she clutched that small card like a lifeline. She had walked into this room expecting to be rejected, expecting to prove everyone right, expecting to return home with nothing but another broken dream. Instead, she had shown them exactly who she was, and it turned out that was more than enough. The bus ride home felt like a dream. She sat by the window again, watching the city shrink behind her as the bus rolled back toward the flat fields and open sky she had always known. But everything felt different now. The world looked different. She looked different. In her pocket was the card the judge had given her. She had touched it 100 times already, just to make sure it was real, just to make sure she hadn't imagined the whole thing. When she finally got home, it was late. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. Her mother was sitting at the table, waiting. The moment she walked through the door, her mother stood up, worry written all over her face. "How was the college visit?" her mother asked. She stood there in the doorway, exhausted and overwhelmed, and unable to hold it in any longer. The tears started falling before she could say a word. Her mother rushed to her, wrapping her arms around her daughter, thinking something terrible had happened. "What's wrong? What happened? Are you okay?" She pulled back and looked at her mother through blurry eyes. And then she told her everything. She told her about the flyer, about the audition, about the 6-hour bus ride, and the marble floors, and the crystal chandeliers. She told her about the other kids, with their coaches, and their expensive clothes. She told her about the judges who looked bored before she even played a note. And then she told her what happened when she started to play. Her mother listened without saying a word. When the story was finished, when she described the standing ovation, and the silver-haired judge and the card now sitting in her pocket, her mother just stared at her. "You did all that," her mother whispered. "By yourself?" She nodded. Her mother's face crumpled. She pulled her daughter close and held her so tight it almost hurt. Her body shook with quiet sobs. "I'm sorry," her mother said into her hair. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe in you more." "You believed in me," she said. "You were just scared." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the little kitchen where everything had started, where a broken keyboard had changed a 7-year-old girl's life forever. The phone call came 3 days later. She was sitting on the porch when her mother came running out, the house phone pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. "It's them," her mother said. "The academy." Her heart nearly stopped. She took the phone with shaking hands and pressed it to her ear. The voice on the other end belonged to the silver-haired judge. She spoke warmly, like they were old friends instead of strangers who had met once in an audition room. She didn't waste time with small talk. She got straight to the point. The scholarship was hers. Full tuition, room and board. Everything covered. They wanted her to start in the fall. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and she had to grab the porch railing to keep from falling. "Are you still there?" the judge asked gently. "Yes," she managed to say. "I'm here. Good. Because I want you to know something. We had over 300 applicants this year, some of the most talented young musicians I've ever seen. And the decision was unanimous. Every single judge chose you." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. "You have a gift," the judge continued. "A rare and extraordinary gift. And it's our honor to help you share it with the world." The next few months passed in a blur. Packing her things, saying goodbye to the church where she had taught herself to play, hugging her parents at the bus station while her mother cried and her father tried to stay strong even though his eyes were red. The academy was everything she had dreamed of, and more. The practice rooms had perfect pianos that never went out of tune. The teachers were masters who had performed on the greatest stages in the world. The other students were talented and driven. But this time, she wasn't invisible. This time, they knew her name. It wasn't easy. Nothing worth having ever is. She worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. Late nights, early mornings, hours of practice until her fingers ached and her back screamed for rest. But she loved every second of it. For the first time, she was surrounded by people who understood her. People who heard music the way she did. People who spoke her language. She graduated at the top of her class. The offers came flooding in after that. Concert halls wanted her to perform. Record labels wanted to sign her. Newspapers and magazines wanted to tell her story. The girl who came from nowhere, the self-taught prodigy who shocked the world. She did her first major performance in a sold-out theater in the same city where she had auditioned years before. She wore a simple black dress. Nothing fancy. Nothing flashy. When she walked onto that stage and saw the crowd, saw the thousands of faces looking up at her with expectation and wonder, she almost couldn't believe it was real. Her parents were in the front row. Her mother was already crying before she played a single note. Her father sat straight and proud, his rough hands folded in his lap, his eyes shining with tears he refused to let fall. She sat down at the grand piano. The spotlight was warm on her skin. The room fell silent, and then she played. She played the same piece she had played at her audition. The one with no name. The one that held everything she had ever felt, everything she had ever been, everything she had ever dreamed. When the last note faded, the audience erupted. They rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Some of them wiping tears from their eyes. She stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the love pouring toward her from every direction. But she wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at her parents. Her mother was sobbing openly now, clutching her father's arm. Her father had finally let the tears fall, streaming down his weathered face without shame. They looked at their daughter standing on that stage, bathed in light, and she knew what they were thinking. This was their little girl. The quiet one. The invisible one. The one who used to sneak out at night to play piano in an empty church. Look at her now. The years that followed brought more success than she had ever imagined. World tours, awards, standing ovations in countries she had only read about in books. Critics called her one of the greatest pianists of her generation. They wrote about her technique, her emotion, her ability to make people feel things they couldn't put into words. But the fame was never the point. When she had enough money, she did something that mattered more to her than any award. She started a foundation. A program that provided free music education to children from families like hers. Kids who couldn't afford lessons. Kids who had talent but no opportunity. Kids who were invisible, just like she had been. She visited schools in small towns and forgotten neighborhoods. She sat down with children who reminded her of herself and told them the truth. People will tell you to be realistic, she said. They'll tell you to know your place. They'll tell you that some doors aren't meant for people like you. She would pause and look into their eyes, making sure they were listening. Don't believe them. The world doesn't get to decide who you are. You decide. And if you have a dream, if you have something burning inside you that won't let go, then you hold on to it. You fight for it. You prove them all wrong. She thought often about that night in the church. The moonlight through the windows. The old piano with its sticky keys. The girl who played in the dark because she had nowhere else to go. That girl had been told she was nothing. That she would never amount to anything. That dreams were for other people. But she had refused to listen. And because she refused, because she kept playing even when no one was watching, because she submitted that application when everyone told her not to, she had changed her life. She had changed her family's life. And now she was changing the lives of children who needed someone to believe in them. Someone once asked her in an interview what she wanted her legacy to be. She thought about it for a long moment before answering. I want every kid who feels invisible to know that being unseen doesn't mean being unworthy, she said. Sometimes the world just hasn't looked closely enough yet. But your moment will come. And when it does, you have to be ready. She smiled, thinking about that girl in the thrift store dress who walked into an audition with nothing but a song in her heart. They underestimated me, she said quietly. And one tune was all it took to show them they were wrong.